You leave a relationship because it keeps draining you. A year later, different person, different place, same tightness, same over-explaining, same feeling that you are slowly disappearing inside something you thought was new. Or you fix one money problem, only to find yourself under a different kind of pressure a few months later. Or you finally escape one chaotic environment and somehow end up in another one that feels strangely familiar. If you keep reading that as bad luck, you will stay trapped at the level of costumes. And that is the risk. Life can keep changing faces while the same structure keeps taking your energy, your time, and your direction. In the next few minutes, I want to show you the hidden mistake behind recurring problems, why the same kind of mess can keep returning through different people and situations, and how to spot the pattern before it hardens into the same outcome again. Because what keeps finding you is often not a random event. It is a form. Most people look at repetition and ask, why do I keep attracting this? But that question is already one step too late. Because by the time you can name the outer event, the inner arrangement that made it readable, tolerable, or irresistible has usually already been there for a while. That is the first thing to see. What repeats is almost never just the storyline. It is the structure beneath it, the role you keep occupying, the feeling you keep reproducing, the inner bargain you keep making without noticing. Different outer scenes, same hidden signature. And once you see that, a lot of confusion starts collapsing. Because recurring problems stop looking mystical in the cheap sense. They stop looking like random punishment. They stop looking like fate playing games with you. They begin to look lawful, not simple, not mechanical, but lawful. A repeated effect suggests a repeated cause, not always the same visible cause, not always the same person doing the same thing, but some cause is still active. Something in the arrangement is still producing versions of the same result. Here is a simple way to picture it. Imagine a seal pressed into wax. You can change the color of the wax. You can change the table, the room, the hand holding the seal. But if the seal is the same, the impression keeps returning. That is how many life problems work. You think the wax is the story. The real issue is the stamp. And this is where people usually go wrong. They spend years fighting wax. They change cities, jobs, partners, practices, routines, and language. Sometimes those changes are necessary. But if the stamp remains untouched, the next surface begins to carry the same mark. So, what is the stamp? Very often, it is not a belief in the shallow sense. It is more like an organizing pattern, a way of entering life, a way of bracing, a way of interpreting, a way of consenting, a way of completing certain dynamics. You may keep entering situations already prepared to earn your place, already prepared to become smaller to keep connection, already prepared to confuse urgency with importance, already prepared to abandon your own reading the moment someone stronger enters the room. And once that preparation is active, the outer world does not need to be identical. It only needs to provide material. This is why the same problem can return through completely different forms. A controlling parent becomes a controlling partner. A humiliating workplace becomes a friendship where you are always slightly below. A money crisis becomes a schedule crisis, but the underlying rhythm is still the same. Pressure, narrowing, reaction, collapse, different scene. Same law. Now here is the part that makes this more exact. The pattern does not only repeat because you believe something. It repeats because inner states also create sympathies. They prepare a fit. Certain conditions in you behave like active forces. They look for passive material. A person who will play the role. An environment that can carry the charge. A situation that lets the old movement complete itself. That is why repetition often feels eerie. Not because the universe is mocking you. Because once a pattern is active, it starts recognizing what belongs to it. And what belongs to it starts recognizing you. So if you want to read your life more clearly, stop asking only, What happened again? Ask something better. What was already moving in me before this became visible? That question changes everything, because the deepest repetitions usually begin before the event itself, before the argument, before the bad decision, before the attachment, before the collapse. They begin in a shift of state. Your attention narrows. Your tempo changes. Your standards blur. Your need becomes louder than your discernment. And now the pattern is no longer waiting for a problem. It is already building one. This is also why people misread recurrence. They think the proof is outside, but the outer event is often the last part of the chain, not the first. The first part is subtler. A familiar rush, a familiar fog, a familiar compromise, a familiar surrender of inner authority. And if that sounds small, good, because that smallness is exactly where your leverage lives. Let's pause here for a second. So far, the point is not that every difficulty is your fault, and it is not that every wound was self-created. The point is simpler and sharper than that. If different situations keep delivering the same inner result, there is a pattern beneath the story. And if there is a pattern, then there is something to read before the next version fully forms. That is the second half of this. How do you read it without becoming paranoid, guilty, or superstitious? You read for sameness. Not sameness of event, sameness of function. Who do you become in the pattern? Not in theory, in practice. Do you become the one who over-explains? The one who waits too long? The one who tolerates confusion because clarity might cost connection? The one who becomes impressive instead of honest? The one who lets pressure decide? Then read for sameness of feeling, not surface emotion. Organizing feeling, smaller, rushed, indebted, foggy, hyper-alert, invisible, compelled. Then read for sameness of bargain. This is where the hidden engine often sits. If I stay useful, I will be kept. If I stay vague, I will stay safe. If I prove enough, I will finally be respected. If I remain available, I will not be abandoned. If I keep enduring, something good will eventually notice me. That bargain is rarely spoken out loud, but it arranges perception. It shapes timing. It changes what you ignore, what you excuse, and what you enter. And once you see the bargain, something very important happens. The problem stops being, why does this always happen to me? And becomes, what in me keeps preparing a place for this? That is not self-blame. That is recovery of participation. Because as long as the pattern is called luck, destiny, bad timing, or just another wrong person, you are left waiting for better surfaces. But when you see the structure, a new possibility appears. You stop trying to control every outer form and start becoming exact about the inner movement that keeps making certain forms possible. That is where repetition begins to weaken. Not when you become perfect, not when life becomes easy, not when you finally force certainty. It weakens when the pattern no longer moves through you unconsciously. When you can feel the old arrangement trying to form and say, there it is. The old narrowing, the old bargain, the old version of me this problem requires. And once you can see that, you are no longer standing inside pure repetition. You are standing at the threshold of a break, not because the world suddenly changes first, but because the stamp is no longer invisible. And when the stamp is no longer invisible, the next impression is no longer inevitable. That is the real promise here. Not that life becomes random in your favor, that it becomes more readable than it was before. And when life becomes readable, it also becomes more changeable, because then you stop chasing costumes and start meeting causes.